Welcome to the second webinar of a 3-webinar series, How to Empower Middle Leaders. The first webinar, How to Select Middle Leaders, is available at www.pdacademia.com if you'd like to watch that. You can also register for the third webinar, April 24th, which is going to be on how to set goals with middle leaders. During this webinar, at any time, if you feel that I'm making references to content that you're not familiar with, odds are that it was in the first webinar or directly from the book, Hidden in Plain Sight, Realizing the Full Potential of Middle Leaders, where a lot of the content from today's webinar is really drawn from. Please go to www.pdacademia.com so that you can watch other videos or even read excerpts from the book so you can get that context. A little information about myself. I'm a Council of International Schools affiliated consultant. I work with schools largely in the capacity of leadership development, strategic planning, and governance. Myself, I'm based in Hong Kong with my family, who you can see there, my wife, Barbara, and our 2 children, Helena and Marco. My wife is an international school teacher and somebody who I draw a lot of inspiration and also anecdotal information from. As you can see on the right side, I also have a picture there of myself scuba diving. I'm a technical scuba diver. One thing that's incredibly important to me are teams. I'm a team player. Every aspect of my life really revolves around being a part of team. And that's largely because I feel that I'm a better person when I'm with a team, working interdependently with others. Not only do I do better work, but I learn so much more. And what I'm going to be introducing to you today is leadership strategies to improve teaching and learning in a team environment. Our objectives for today are to discuss the importance of clarifying purpose, and that's largely the first leadership strategy. As a leader, you need to ensure that you clarify the purpose for what you want your teams to achieve and how you think they might be able to achieve it. Depending on the capacity and capabilities of your team and team leader, will really determine how much detail you need to go into about going out and achieving an objective. The next strategy that we're going to be talking about is the development of a middle leadership team and the importance of having a middle leadership team, not only to help our leaders understand what's going on across the school, but being able to surface concerns that they might share. And by being able to surface those concerns, they might be able to collaboratively address them. This would be a great support to senior leadership because a lot of the problems that surface up from teams generally go straight to senior leadership. If we can capture it at the middle leadership level, we'll be much more able to effectively deal with it. The third strategy I'll be sharing with you today that will directly contribute to improving teaching and learning in a school is about creating sandboxes. Sandboxes where teachers can play and work together to develop new practice. And before actually introducing that practice to other teachers that may not be ready for it, they'll have the opportunity to perfect it. Now, some practices may not work the way they want. So therefore, within a sandbox, they also have the opportunity to fail without actually affecting anybody else's work. Sandboxes are an incredibly important leadership strategy, and that will be the last one we talk about. But sandboxes cannot be effective if you don't have clarity of purpose. Before I share with you the first leadership strategy on clarifying purpose, I want to share with you some of the content that influenced today's webinar, as well as quotes that readers have reported back to me that they found very thought-provoking. The first one is understanding why our teams exist. In our book, I talk about the difference between working groups and teams. Now, this is derived from Project Aristotle, a project that Google initiated and really helped us to better understand team leadership from the perspective of, are we expecting our teams just to report in and do tasks, or are they going to be working meaningfully towards achieving some greater purpose that requires interdependency? Now, a team is defined by that latter definition, working together interdependently to achieve some purpose. Whereas if we have a team leader, quote unquote, who we're actually going to call a supervisor for a working group that's largely just intended to deliver information to the team and make sure that they're doing their tasks, then I would say that the type of work that they're working on is going to be very different. In the working group scenario, they're going to have a very short-term horizon in terms of just working on tasks. Whereas a team has a longer-term horizon, are going to be working more on outcomes. Now, I'm going to get more into that in my third webinar about how to set goals. But this is very important to remember if you're going to empower middle leaders, because middle leaders that are just expected to supervise don't really need empowerment. They just need clarity in terms of what the team needs to do. Now, an additional quote that actually is more important for senior leaders is the fact that if we want our middle leaders to be driving change through the school, we need to be constantly aligning them with this organization's main strategic objectives. This is probably the most principal role of senior leadership, in the fact that they need to be constantly communicating with their middle leaders about what's important within the organization, how the organization is developing, and how middle leaders can help the organization achieve its strategic objectives. Therefore, empowering middle leaders to actually go into their teams and ensure that the teams are setting goals that are aligned with the organization. Now, as we move through the book and progress through today's leadership strategies, the next quote I want to bring to your attention is about, if we are going to be empowering middle leaders to achieve transformational change in our schools, they need a longer horizon in their role to be working in. And I would argue that we need our middle leaders to serve in these roles for 3 to 5 years. If they're only going to be in that role for 1 year, maybe 2 years, it limits them to what they can do that's transformational. For those that are largely in a role for 1 year, all they can do is administrate and make sure that their teams are doing the work. And again, the goals are going to be on this short-term horizon, mainly administrative and task-driven. Whereas if a middle leader knows they're going to be with the team for 2 to 3 years, they might actually take on more ambitious goals. And by doing so, they're going to spend more time on team building. So this is a very important expectation to set from the beginning. Next, when we actually look at empowering our middle leaders, we need to let them know that it's okay to fail. Now, this is where we're going to talk about the sandbox today on our third leadership strategy, because the sandbox is the best place to allow failure to take place, because it's not going to impact the rest of the school community. You're not going to be judged or evaluated based on it. In fact, you might even be celebrated for what you're trying to do. And as you share that with other teams, they might be able to contribute ideas on how you can improve it. Now, before I start talking about the first strategy, I want to share with you an anecdote from a team that I worked with, a team that was very passionate about developing the skills and dispositions of agentic learning within their students. However, they were conflicted by the organization's strategic aims. And the organization's strategic aims in this particular case were to make their math and language instruction more structured. Now, this is the dilemma. We want to, as a team, foster agentic learning. We want students to be accountable for their learning. But the school is asking us to have greater structure and rigor in our curriculum for maths and English. How do we actually balance these two? Is there a way that we can actually do both? Because if we're focusing purely on adding more structure, that's going to leave very little time for us to collaborate meaningfully around developing the skills and dispositions for agentic learning. Now, when I was working with this particular team, I also want to note that this was a very high functioning team in the school, and probably the highest functioning team. Many teams in this particular case would probably put any ambitions they have on what they want to work on the shelf. This particular team, though, thought, hey, why can't we try to address both? Is there a way that we can actually find that balance of having that structure and that rigor, but at the same time, finding that right or appropriate time and the tools to where we can hand over the accountability to the students so that they could take greater ownership over their learning? So in this way, the question that I was working on with this team is, how can we maintain the commitment to developing the dispositions and skills in grade 6 students that will support more effective agents of learning, while also adding more structured and consistent math and language practices across the grade? This is a great question. This is a great goal. As far as inquiry goes, it's very specific to the scope that they're working within, grade 6. It's defining the challenge that they have in terms of trying to find that balance between what they really are passionate about and what they want to do, but what the school is also asking them to do. And by collaboratively engaging in this question, hopefully they're going to be able to find that sweet spot to where they can align with what the school needs. Because if they're able to find that sweet spot, they're going to be able to bring in their values and beliefs into the work that they do. And by bringing in those values and beliefs, they're also going to be able to define the behaviors that they need to adopt or demonstrate so that they can achieve that core purpose. So a lot of what I'm showing here is really derived from Jim Collins' work in terms of going good to great. And even if you go back and you want to research back in the 90s and early 2000s, where this came from really is about having big, hairy, audacious goals, the BHAGs. For those of you that are more familiar with starting with why and Simon Sinek, you'll find a lot of similarity here. Because if we're expecting our teams to pursue some type of outcome, transformational change, they need to be able to address why. Why is incredibly important because we work in time-starved schools. If teachers have to decide between pursuing something that they're passionate about and doing the work that they're paid for, more often than not, they're actually going to gravitate towards the work that they're paid for, doing the administrative tasks, the easy things, the things they understand, the things that don't have a lot of conflict, because it's just about getting things done. But this also creates disenfranchisement. And in creating this disenfranchisement, it's also going to hinder them or possibly even in a way demotivate them from wanting to pursue transformative change later on in the school year or in their career. So we need to make sure why is always an important part of the work that we're asking them to do. But, and this is what I would argue with Simon Sinek, he's missing out, it's aligning your personal why with the organization's why. And when you can find that sweet spot, which is really belief driven, then you can identify the behaviors that you need to demonstrate to achieve that core purpose. Again, this is coming from Jim Collins' Good to Great, as well as the research and the idea behind big, hairy, audacious goals, BHAGs. So if you're looking to research and find more information, that's the place to start. Now, alignment is incredibly important. And as I said this earlier, in terms of that one quote from the book about how the organization needs to be aligned and senior leadership's major role is constantly working to align the teams with the organization, hopefully this image will speak to you in a way and make more sense to you in terms of what your role is as a senior leader, as well as if you're a middle leader or an aspiring leader, where your team fits into the bigger picture. Now, again, I'm going to refer back to Jim Collins as well as other management consultants throughout the 80s and 90s that spoke to the importance of purpose within an organization, especially vision and mission. Now, many would argue, and what I would agree with, is the fact that your vision and your mission is enduring. It doesn't change every 3 to 5 years, especially as you have a new head of school or principal coming in. The vision should be probably the most enduring. That's the reason why the school exists. That's the why. That comes back to Michael Fullan's moral purpose and for how we're going to work together. Within that vision should be the values that we want our community to demonstrate. The mission is how we're going to achieve or realize that vision. Again, it should also be fairly enduring, but can change. Now, what I would argue that needs to change and be looked at yearly, if not every 3 years, is the strategy. The strategy is what allows us to be flexible to what's happening within our environment. I would say even during this time of COVID-19, our vision should be inspiring and help us guide in terms of the types of actions and response we need to make based on what our community expects from us. Our mission might actually also still be relevant during this period, but the strategy we take is going to change. And therefore, we want our teams to align with that strategy. And that strategy should also be aligned with the mission and the vision. Now, when you achieve this level of alignment, teams are going to have greater clarity of purpose. And this is coming back to the first leadership strategy, clarity of purpose. If you want to improve teaching and learning, ensure you know ensure your teams know what they need to do. In this particular case, when it comes to team purpose, it's not just establishing a purpose like that grade 6 team that I was referring to earlier. When it comes to trying to balance that need for wanting to pursue, how do we develop the skills and dispositions for agentic learning against the school's requirements that they need to make their curriculum more rigorous and structured for math and English. Now, as the team begins to pursue and answer that question, they're going to come up with a purpose statement. I'm going to show you here in a few minutes how to devise and draft that purpose statement. But beyond the purpose statement, now we need to have goals. And the important thing about goals is it's not just the team goal. There needs to be a leadership goal and there needs to be personal goals. The leadership goal should somehow be aligned as well with what the team purpose is. It doesn't necessarily need to be about the skills and dispositions of agentic learning or understanding how to create better curriculum. In fact, what it could be is, how do I manage up? Here's a great leadership goal in this case. I have a senior leadership that's pushing us to structure our curriculum more, but I have a team that's pushing back and saying, hey, we're an IB school. It's about agentic learning, inquiry-based learning. Why are we trying to make our curriculum more structured? I would say a great leadership goal in this instance would be, how do I manage up? How do I transfer this information and this desire from my team to leadership to influence them in terms of what we're going to be working on? Now, that's your leadership goal. Now, in terms of the team goal, it could be about trying to find that balance. And the goal itself could be actually iterated in several different ways to actually begin looking at researching, observation, beginning to actually scale any sort of learning tools or resources that you're using. So we can look at that team goal as something that everybody can connect to. But I also think it's really important that people have personal goals that align throughout the organization down to their very reason for existence. And this is a great opportunity when we start looking at it. Maybe you have some members on the team that are more motivated by researching. Maybe you have some members of your team that really just want to get into other people's classrooms. Maybe you have some members of your teams that are really just interested in the IB curriculum in itself. So they could be looking at structuring curriculum at the same time, trying to make sure it meets the needs of IB and that of the school. So their personal goals, in many ways, meet their personal needs, their why, their beliefs, and can contribute back into the team goal, that time when we're meeting interdependently. And this is all driven by inquiry. The very first sort of slide I showed you about that grade 16 is driven by this question of how are we going to achieve this? And then they devise their team purpose. Now, alignment is very difficult, and there's a few questions you need to consider as you begin to pursue this form of alignment. Firstly, does the purpose you seek to achieve align with the school's strategic objectives and or support the school's guiding statements? You need to be able to answer how. Now, I've explained the importance of this, but if you cannot explicitly say how, it's going to be very difficult for you to manage up and get the support from senior leadership you need to be able to drive the change that your team is going to be most motivated by. Next, is the outcome you seek to achieve short, mid, or long term? This again is incredibly important. How long is your team going to be together? If you start to work towards a purpose that will take about 2 to 3 years, can we actually expect our team to be together during that time? Will you still be leading the team during that time? So we don't want to set ourselves up for failure, start going down a road to where we're going to have no closure. So we have to be realistic in what our expectations are in terms of what we want to pursue. Next, does the team have enough time together? This relates back to my second question. It's really reflecting on the time they have together over the year, 2 years, or 3 years, but also week to week. How much time do they have to where they can actually set aside time to explore this purpose? There's a lot of other work that teams are doing, and that work is often administrative. It might be parent-teacher meetings. It might be setting up for an event. It might be, reviewing or doing some type of common planning that isn't necessarily related to the team's purpose. How much time can you actually carve out for the team to do the work that it wants to do? That's going to actually connect with our third strategy today, sandboxes. So just be mindful of that as you set up your purpose. Now, things to consider as you start to draft a purpose statement is, who are you? Are you partners, facilitators, advocates, knowledge managers? These types of roles, or the way that we actually identify ourselves within our community, become very important, because if you're advocates, you're the one as a team that need to go out and create the argument for why, hey, all right, it's important to have a structured curriculum, but we're an IB school and we need to also be able to serve that mandate. So therefore, as an advocate, you're going to go out and research best practices that's going to try to find that sweet spot between what the school wants and curricularly where you want to go and what you want to realize. Next, how will you do it? Are you going to be demonstrating this through creative and critical thinking, interdisciplinary planning, through developing lesson plans that actually demonstrate both structure as well as developing skills and dispositions for agentic learning? And when you do that, how are you going to share that with the community? Next, why do we do it? The moral purpose. Coming back to understanding that if this work, this purpose-driven work that we're doing has our values instilled in it, we're actually going to be much more committed to it. And if we're much more committed to it, things such as time are no longer going to become a problem. Sure, they're an obstacle, but when you're committed to something, you find ways around those obstacles. You don't let those obstacles end up being just walls that are insurmountable. You will climb them. You will break them down. So let's take a look at that grade level team again, and let's kind of take a look at what a purpose statement would be for them. So take a minute or so just to read this and reflect on it. You know, think back to that original question that they had. I'm just going to flick back to that here in a minute. So feel free to pause the screen if you want to capture and read it. I'm going to come back here just to think about the dilemma. This was the question. From that question, and understanding about the importance of keeping that the values and beliefs in alignment with the school are first and foremost, that you need to define who you are, how you will do it, and why you will do it. Hopefully you'll be able to distill a statement like this. This statement becomes incredibly important. It becomes the basis for all the work that you do. Every time you meet, this is why you meet. People won't be coming into meetings and doing emails or grading or other planning while you're trying to facilitate a meeting if you're a middle leader. Instead, they'll know that this is why we're meeting, this is why this time is set aside, and you will have their complete attention because they're bought into it, because it's already a part of them. It's part of their values and their beliefs. This is what they want to do. And more importantly, as you start to pursue it, conflict no longer becomes something that we become scared of. Conflict is something that we welcome because it's that conflict from which that we can innovate. And through that conflict, get those different perspectives and ideas. And as a team that's working together with a shared purpose, we're going to be much more open to each other's ideas. We're going to be much more trusting of each other, especially, and this is going to come to our third strategy, when we build that sandbox, because it won't matter if we fail. We're not being evaluated on that. There's no reason to have a fear of evaluation in this particular case. So when you're working purposefully, make sure that your meetings are about that purpose. And if they are, make sure you're facilitating them in such a way that you're attending to those needs of your team members. Now, here I have another dilemma to introduce you to, which is really about our second strategy, and that's introducing the middle leadership team. In this particular case, again, it was a team that I was working with. They were not a formal team at that point, but after our meeting, they became a team. And the reason I was called to this school was because I was there to give middle leadership development training. Well, one of the things that I think is really important when I bring middle leaders together for the first time that aren't a formal team, don't have the experience or even the knowledge or tools to work together effectively, is I like to introduce protocols. In this particular case, after we'd already done a full day of training, I wanted to end the day with a consultancy protocol. And the consultancy protocol was an opportunity for one of the members to actually present a problem that they had. And as they presented that problem, I want to kind of give you the context. The person was the head of faculty for maths. This is a secondary school. And the head of school was also invited into this particular consultancy protocol because I thought this was an excellent opportunity to bridge middle leadership with senior leadership. Now, often in these workshops, senior leadership like to step out. They like to go away and say, hey, this is for you guys. I don't want to interrupt. I want you to talk freely. I know if I'm in the room, you're not going to be able to. But at this particular point, I thought it was a great opportunity to get senior leadership back in the room so that they can understand and experience what middle leadership we're dealing with, and also help to work with them to be part of the problem, not as a facilitator, not as a leader, but more importantly, as a team member. So in this particular case, the head of maths was very worried about a few students. As we started to work through the protocol, interestingly enough, the head of English and the head of science also said, you know what? I know who you're talking about. You didn't name names, but I guarantee you those 5 students are in my class as well. They didn't even, the head of math didn't even say the number of students. The head of science is one that said, I know who the 5 kids are. The head of English said, I know who the 5 kids are. Ultimately, what came from this is now the head of math was like, oh, so this is interesting. Different subject areas, shared problem. We actually have a shared purpose. That shared purpose to help these students that are struggling, that most likely will not complete their A-level examinations, that we have a shared purpose to help get them through this period to better prepare them. Whereas if I was just dealing with this by myself and you were dealing with just by yourself, we might be doing different actions to support the student that could potentially be incoherent and conflict with each other, making it much more difficult to support the student. But now we have this shared concern. So as they worked through this, it's really important to note that they never would have talked about this unless I was called in to do a PD. They never would have talked about this because they did not have a middle leadership team. They did not have protocols or process for actually sharing concerns. And they didn't actually have a channel to senior leadership. Now, often what would have happened is head of maths at some point would have said, I can't help these kids. I don't know what to do. And senior leadership would have been, all right, well, you know, let's try some things. Let me give you some resources. Maybe head of English might have funneled it up. Maybe head of science would have funneled it up. Senior leadership, and especially if they're actually addressing it to different senior leadership members, probably would have lost it, not connected it. Now we have an opportunity to surface it, have a shared purpose to address it, and be able to channel it effectively to those that can give us the resources to fix it. This is why this becomes the most important strategy. And one of the things that I want to share with you about establishing a middle leadership team is that you might actually have a middle leadership team in your school that you call a team, but they're probably more like a working group. And a working group would be like pooled interdependence, where basically your senior leader comes in, tells the middle leadership team what's going on, what they need to tell their teams and what they need to do. Then middle leaders go back to their teams, tell them what they need to do, they get it done, they report it back to the senior leaders in a meeting. That's an example of pooled interdependent, where you're gonna have a bunch of different tasks that are being reported back to your senior leadership to contribute to some overall product that senior leadership is the owner of. No one else really has ownership or accountability over it. Where I want to begin getting you to think around is, how do we take a middle leadership team from being a pooled interdependent team to a reciprocal interdependent team? A reciprocal interdependent team actually surfaces areas of concern that they share and then address them. Now, the problem is your typical middle leadership team has a very low coordination demand, because it's really just coming into a meeting, getting the information you need, and then going back to your teams. Whereas the time it takes to actually go through these protocols and actually work through common problems to achieve and realize some sort of common purpose takes time. Now, how's that time set aside? Who's facilitating? This becomes the real problem with the middle leadership team. And I want to kind of draw your attention to some questions you need to consider. Does a team of leaders need a leader? So when you have a middle leadership team together, does there need to be a team leader? Does senior leadership need to be a part of that team? Now, I would advocate that senior leadership should be in that team, but should not lead the team. They should not facilitate the meetings. They should be participants in the meetings. Next, why does this team exist? I would advocate for keeping it simple. Keeping it simple to the extent that this is an opportunity for us to raise concerns about the things that our teams are working on so that we can address them, especially if there's a shared concern, something that we can each go back into our teams and trial different solutions and report back to each other about how it's working. What does this team do? Well, this team largely is sharing concerns. They're bringing information from the front lines up to this middle level, seeing that as a team, can they address it themselves without it surfacing to senior leadership, and then being able to work back within their teams the solutions that they come up with. Now, how does this team do it? This team does it simply just by meeting and talking with each other, sharing ideas. If nothing else, it also becomes a form of support that becomes incredibly important, especially if you believe in such things as attachment theory and how important it is just to have people close to you that you can lean on. Leaning on people, especially at the middle leadership level, is so incredibly important. Now, as we move from the middle leadership team and we start thinking about the third strategy, and something that I've been building up a lot, so hopefully I don't disappoint you, but we're going to be talking about the sandbox. Now, the reason for the sandbox is two or threefold, but one of the most important reasons why we need a sandbox is this issue of time. And what I would argue that if you have a shared purpose, a purpose that really aligns your values and beliefs with that of the organization and the strategic objectives that they need to do, you're going to find people seeing time as less of an issue and finding solutions to time more effectively. And especially knowing, when I said this was about a two or threefold sort of dilemma, also the sandbox is going to create an environment where you can focus solely on that purpose. So many times, and especially like different cases that I bring up in my book, where you might actually find yourself leading a team and you come across and you build consensus on a purpose that you want to do. And next thing you know, you have a meeting, and what happens? Senior leadership comes in and says, hey, do you mind if I take 15 minutes of your meeting? Because there's something I need to talk about with your teachers. All of a sudden, that time for that purpose gets eaten up because we didn't actually sandbox it. We didn't protect it. We didn't find a way to actually make explicit to everybody else that, hey, this is what we're doing and this is why we're doing it. It aligns with what the school needs, so you need to stay out of our sandbox. We can't allow our sandbox to get dirty. And when I think about this as well, let's start thinking about the demands for coordination. If we're working within a sandbox, the sandbox is really physically and literally a meeting. It's your meeting room. It's a room, desk, chairs, whiteboard, chart paper, whatever else you need just to talk about the purpose and to work towards the purpose that you want to achieve. But it's a meeting. That's physically what a sandbox is. Now, is this meeting going to be where we're working in a pooled interdependent way where I'm going to assign a bunch of different tasks to each person and then they're going to report into me and I'm going to try to put it together? I'm the ultimate like overall product owner. Or are we going to be working in this reciprocal interdependent way, learning from each other, sharing ideas? Then we need to accept the fact that the sandbox is going to take a greater coordination demand. And that time that's required to coordinate is going to come at the expense of the team leader. So therefore, if you want to empower your team leaders and you want them to build sandboxes where they can innovate, you need to give your middle leaders more time. You need to at least free up 1 or 2 blocks, because the time to coordinate the tasks and the work that the team is doing towards working towards something that's transformatively, that's going to transform education, teaching, and learning actually is very time consuming. And on top of that, many of our team leaders are also teachers. They have their own lesson plans and grading and parent meetings to attend to. So therefore, that is why they need more time within the master schedule, more blocks freed up for them to actually lead. Otherwise, they're just supervisors. They only have the time to report to their teams and make sure their teams are doing what's expected of them at an administrative level. If you don't give them the time to lead, they won't be able to lead. And if you do give them the time to lead, then we need to make sure that they're leading in a sandbox. Because in that sandbox, this is where they're going to be able to work on a purpose, not have it cluttered or muddied by any other types of initiatives that might be going on around the school, nor anybody else that wants to come in and use that team for its own purpose. Furthermore, they're going to feel comfortable enough to where they can fail within this sandbox. So when they're actually meeting, they're going to talk about the things that are going right as well as the things that are going wrong. They're going to identify things that they can do. They're going to go out and do them. They're going to invite their other teachers to come into their classroom and say, hey, this is what I'm working on today. This is the question I'm trying to answer. I would like you to be in my room to help me understand if I'm answering this question. And if I am, great. Help me understand how I can communicate that to other teachers. Let's scale this great practice. If I'm not, give me feedback. Help me understand how I can improve it. In our sandbox, that's what we're doing. Now, it's very important to understand that within our sandbox, maybe not everybody is going to be able to fit in it. Now, it's important to understand one key principle from the book, 10-20-40-20-10. I have it here at the bottom of the slide. Now, the 10-20-40-20, the 10-20-40-20-10 is a bit of a tongue twister. This rule of thumb is based on the fact that within our schools, And within our teams, 10% of the people are going to be champions. They're ready for change. They're not just ready for it, they want to lead it. The next 20% are ready for change, but they need some guidance. They want to participate, but they need to understand how they can be a part of it. They also need that purpose clarified. The front 10% are willing to clarify the purpose, get in there and really try to define it. The 20%, once it's defined, are going to jump right on. The next 40% are what we call our fence sitters. Now, fence sitters, they're not against change, but they're also not for change. They're just very busy. They don't have time to go on into new initiatives. So we have to be careful with the fence sitters, because if we move too quick, they're actually going to go to this other end of the spectrum, that back end of the 20 and 10. Now, the very end of the spectrum, that final 10%, those are the enemy. They're going to undermine change initiatives. And it's not because they're a bad person, but their experience tells them, great, one more thing that we got to do, one more thing we're not going to bring closure to, one more thing that's going to prevent me from actually being able to add value to my classroom. So why do I got to do it? In fact, I'll tell you why I'm not going to do it. The 20% that are just next to them, they're cynics. They also realize it's going to fail, but they're not going to be as open about their cynicism. But I guarantee you, in the meeting, they're the ones that are going to be the devil's advocate. They're the ones that are really going to speak, to this and try to rationalize why we shouldn't be doing something. Not outwardly saying no, but at the same time, their communication and body language will be no. They're also very important, though. I don't want to create any sort of reasons why you might think you need to exclude them. Everybody within this spectrum from 10 to 10, the 20s and the 40s in the middle, they're all important and relevant. Now, what this looks like within the sandbox is we have our walls, we have our meetings. The 10 and the 20, they're going to be really meeting the most and most frequently, as well as spending the most time on this initiative. The next 40%, they're what I'm saying straddling the walls. They know what's going on in the meeting. They don't necessarily need to be in the meeting, but they're getting reports about what's happening in the meeting. Because at some point, when we actually identify practice that's really going to improve teaching and learning, that's when the 40% are going to go, oh my God, it worked. I want to try it. Let me in. Then we can let them into our sandbox. As we let more and more people into the sandbox, it's fair to say that we're going to build momentum for the change so that change can be successful. Now, at the same time, I'm going to advocate for the fact that we should have one of the 20% on the back end, the cynics. We should have a cynic in the sandbox, because we don't want groupthink to take place. We need these cynics because they are going to ask the questions that others might be afraid to ask about failure. They are going to bring up the relevant experience saying, hey, we did this last year. It didn't work. And then we actually can come back to them and say, well, hey, what are some of the things that contributed to it not working? Identifying that, and then looking for strategies to overcome it. That is why everybody on this spectrum is incredibly important across the 10, 20, 40, 20, 10. They all are going to play a role at some point. But one last thing I want to make you mindful of. As we move towards making change, as we actually start working towards changing our practices, towards improving teaching and learning from the perspective that we feel is better, there are members in our community that might not agree. They might not agree to project-based learning. They might not agree to the curricular changes that we're doing. Therefore, we have to also be prepared for the fact that even though we're moving in this direction and we're building momentum for change, there are people that are still, if not resisting it, just aren't going to be comfortable with it. They don't believe in it. It doesn't align with their values. And therefore, we have to be very mindful of how they work within our community, and for the fact that they will probably be leaving our community. And I would say it's just as important for how a person comes into the community to be mindful of how they leave the community. We don't want them leaving and being labeled the enemy or the cynic. We just have to accept the fact that their teaching practices aren't aligned with where our community wants to move. And therefore, we should be respectful of that. Now, as you start thinking about your sandbox, again, a few considerations. What's the stage of development that your team is in? This is something that I address in the book, talking about Tuckman stages. If you're working in a sandbox and this is a new team, you're going to have to do some team building. And you're going to have to be prepared for the fact that if you haven't done the team building, you can't really tackle the hard issues yet. Next, what is the culture of that team? Is it a team that is, gung-ho, let's get this going, it's the high-functioning grade 6 team? Or is it a team that, they've been done wrong quite a few times, that they're carrying a lot of baggage from other teams or other schools, in which case we're gonna have to be mindful of that culture. And again, we're gonna have to focus on building trust. Now, lastly, what is the capacity for this team for change? Is there a lot of other initiatives that they're working on? If so, we're gonna have to prioritize those initiatives, try to clear some space for them to actually work. Because if it's too crowded for them, they're not gonna be able to go into a sandbox and not think about all the other things they need to do. Not only do we need to free them physically of the tasks and the other initiatives going on in the school, but we need to free them mentally of it so that they can have that mindfulness to be able to really attend to what they want to work on. Now, these are my 3 strategies for you to improve teaching and learning. First, we covered the importance of clarifying purpose and how not just clarifying purpose gets teams working towards practices that will improve teaching and learning, but it's also going to help them navigate difficult conversations. Teams that work purposefully don't have difficult conversations. They have learning conversations. Next, establishing a middle leadership team. One of the most important strategies I would argue for, and the easiest one to implement, is the middle leadership team, because that becomes a place where middle leaders can meet together, try to surface the concerns they have from their teams, find the ones that are most predominant, work together to address them, and then put solutions back into those teams. And as they do that, they're preventing those problems from rising to senior leadership that can focus more of their energy on keeping teams aligned with the organization's strategic objectives and where the organization is moving. Now, lastly, once teams are able to focus and work purposefully, they need a place to do it. They need a place not only where they feel safe, but also where they know they can fail. And if they do, they can learn. And as they learn, they can improve. And then as they improve, they can welcome more people into their sandbox and scale the effectiveness of the teaching and learning practices that they're coming up with. This, for you, are the 3 most important leadership strategies you can do within your school to improve teaching and learning. Now, if you'd like a copy of my slides, please email me, michael@pdacademia.com. If you found this webinar, as well as my previous one on how to select middle leaders, interesting, please join my April 24th webinar as well on how to set goals with middle leaders. Go to pdacademia.com. You'll find under my book, there is a section for webinars, middle leadership webinars. There's where you can register for the next webinar. Thank you for joining me today and have a great day.